participants nor myself, so I hope everything is kind of fine. Most importantly, you see the slides, right? That's
yes,
I think
yes, we see the slide. We see the slide.
So on the way to the Green Museum, well, you know, the Green Museum is a big debate in Europe with the Green Deal now, but it's not such a new thing. It actually has some history. Not so much of a history, but I would say at least 10 years now we talk internationally about the Green Museum and about issues of sustainability and preservation. And, you know, the time today, if you just open the newspaper every other day, we can actually, how can I move to the next slide? How can I move to the next slide? Doesn't.
Just clicking on the screen, no?
No. Ah, yeah, yes. You know, just on a few weeks ago, you may have seen in the news that there were measured record temperatures in the west coast, the northwest coast of the United States and Canada. So I think the record temperature ever measured in Canada was measured in Lytton, in British Columbia. A couple of days later, on June 30, the whole city burned down. Among the totally lost objects is the Chinese History Museum, you know, ravaged by the wildfire. We are facing a global transformation, right? We are facing a transition from rural to urban societies, which of course have massive implications on cultural heritage. More than half of our world population already lives in urban areas. Every week, the urban population in the world increases by about 1.3 million people. The 50 largest cities would rank on position 3 right after China and the United States on the emission table of detrimental greenhouse gases. And the loss of agricultural land in countries like Egypt, Nigeria is nothing less than dramatic. We also know that in the past 5 decades, humanity has used up more raw materials and produced more garbage than its entire history before. That's a view from the Yale Center in Beijing, and you can see how in the last 10 years the face of the city changed. International tourism, of course, another big issue in the sustainability debate. It's a source of both prosperity but also of decay. Many heritage sites, many museums are struggling with the negative impact of tourism. But we have to also acknowledge that tourism ranks 4th behind fuels, chemicals, and food. 9% of global exports, higher than cars, by the way. In this debate, we often talk about sharing our heritage, right? How can we share our heritage, and what does it mean? It's a debate in the social sphere, but you also open the newspapers and you can read debates about post-colonial heritage museums, which are stuffed with stolen properties from around the world. Maybe you've heard that Germany, I think also like 14 days ago, decided to restitute the Benin bronzes to Nigeria. Actually, they committed to substantial returns. Delegation from Nigeria with the Crown Prince, the Oba, was here in Berlin last week. And I think we're just entering a debate of sharing heritage recently. And you can see this if you use Google Ngram. It's not such an old concept. We only started debating it recently. But for sharing heritage, you know, simply online resources are not enough. Because among the 7.6 billion people, 2017, right, of the world population, half of it doesn't have access to the internet. And this offline population is disproportionately illiterate, it's female, elderly, less educated, less income, and as I said before, more rural. So we have to think how we really can share this heritage, and I think that's another big challenge for our museums, which is called the digital divide. People thought, you know, maybe 30 years ago that with the internet things will get better, but the sad part of the story is that really didn't get better. It's like the same, it doesn't really improve as it should. And there's another important lesson. in conservation. We shift, if you go to the museum concept, traditionally we have this concept that heritage in our collections, in our sites, is a static concept, and we have to shift from the static to a more dynamic picture, because we are facing an inevitability of constant change. Actually, if conservation is management of change, then actually sustainable conservation or good conservation is change management in sustainable conditions. And documenting and measuring actually changes becomes key, right? Measuring changes, like here on a famous sculpture in Germany, the Uta in Naumburg Cathedral, measuring crack development, crack growth with microscopy is a big issue. I'm sorry, there's a phone which is ringing. I hope it doesn't disturb too much. Knowledge networks are important for sharing. With the fourth industrial revolution, we experience increasing collaborative efforts on collecting data, setting standards, and advancing digital technology for cultural heritage preservation across actually humanities and science. And I heard that from Rocco that a lot of the participants whom I can't see, unfortunately, are coming from both fields, from the science field and the humanities field. You can add the business field, you can add social science and law, but it's becoming a really transdisciplinary field. We will need new forms of technology. We will need to address issues of obsolescence, legacy technologies, and data migrations, and also, of course, new methods for formal education in heritage engagement, education, but also in public engagement. Actually, a few years ago, when I was still working at Yale, we had the opportunity to work in the war-torn country of Syria, documenting heritage sites, for example, the Al-Azam Palace in Damascus. When we learn something about heritage, we increase its value. I think that applies to all the speakers in this school in these days, organized by Rocco and in the IPERION program. Knowledge is a contribution to the sum of all the values attributed to cultural heritage. Here you can see an investigation which we made, I think 13 years ago, in the Dreikönigen-Schrein, which is the shrine of the Three Magi in Cologne Cathedral, one of the most important artifacts from the Catholic Church, and made by Nicholas from Verdun. Well, and very importantly, this knowledge needs to be shared among all stakeholders, where transparency becomes key. And I show here another picture of an imaging technology. It's called video holography. It's noise or sound-induced vibrations which can detect detached layers of stucco on one of our, and maybe the one and most important object in the Berlin collection, the bust of Queen Nefertiti. So when we share knowledge, we should not overlook some of the issues we are experiencing with science communication. According to the 2018 report by the National Science Board, only 52% of Americans agree that as human beings, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals. Although this proportion has increased from 42% in 2004, it still lags way behind Canadian, Chinese, or European respondents to this question. Perhaps the most unexpected example of science denial is the apparent revival of the belief that our Earth is flat. This topic was much discussed on mass and social media in the past years. A United States survey reported that only 84% of respondents have always believed that the world is round, whereas 2% in US believe it is really flat, and the rest expressed some uncertainty. And this, of course, applies to climate change as well. It is perceived differently across the world. A Pew Research Center survey, according to this research survey, 54% of global respondents consider climate change a very serious problem. But only 18% of Chinese and only 45% of US residents agree with this view, despite of these two countries being actually the highest carbon emitters worldwide. So there's a lot of heavy information, I think, in the beginning of this presentation. And it's gonna get worse for a moment, but then it's gonna get maybe better. It's gonna get worse with this story of the Spirit Rock. Spirit Rock is in the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin. It's a granite rock. This is a postcard from the 1930s. You can see it's a little rock, right? But you know, it has already a descriptive plate, some explanations what the Spirit Rock of this Native American tribe in Wisconsin is about. In the 1950s, another postcard. Well, you can recognize that it's maybe a little bit better protected than before, but it's also a little bit smaller. When I went to Wisconsin in 2017, the Spirit Rock almost has disappeared. The sad part of the story is that the Indians, the Native Americans, the Menominee Indians said, well, the moment when the stone has disappeared, the human race will be extinct. You know, being a stone conservator by training, I would guess we have another 50 years, 60 years, 70 years if we are lucky, and then that's it. And that makes the debate about the Green Museum even more important than it has ever been. I'm a little bit upset with the Menominee Indians because they could have picked a better stone, I think. That's really a very bad granite stone, which is crumbling down literally year by year. Well, climate change brings not only seawater levels rising, increasing floods, severe weather events, it also has many, many other implications, actually even reaching the access to science, the access to culture, migration, war, conflict. You know, rising seawater levels, like shown here in the Alaskan village of Shishmaref, an island which is inhabited for 4,000 years continuously, is only one little part of what climate change brings about. And I would like to give some tribute to our Scottish colleagues here. Scotland has been at the forefront of science in the 18th century when James Hutton went to Siccar Point, you know, and you can see the two layers interlayering here of stone, the greywacke and the sandstone on top of it, which actually became not only the beginning or kind of the beginning of geology as a scientific discipline, but also, you know, his theory, James Hutton's theory that the Earth continuously underwent transformation and led him to the assumption that the Earth could not be as young as many people believed end of the 18th century, but had to be old millions of years. And again, as I said, tribute to my Scottish colleagues, in 2019, Climate Heritage Network was opened or formed in Edinburgh. Once again, I think our colleagues have been at the forefront of current developments and of current scientific discussion, which is about to reach us in the cultural heritage sector too. Well, let's take a look at the history of this sustainability. In Germany, we like to refer to Hans Carl von Karlowitz, who was a tax accountant and is considered to be the father of sustainable forestry. He is the first one to mention the word Nachhaltigkeit, which is German language for sustainability, in his book Silvicultura Economica from 1713. Which more or less says, you know, that you should not cut more trees than grow back, so that you have a continuous and sustainable use of this resource. The definition we are using today is internationally is going back to the 1987 definition by the Brundtland Commission for the United Nations, which defines sustainable development as a development which meets the needs of current generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We actually can see this reflected nowadays when we look at the Friday for Future kids who are standing up all around the globe and blaming the older generation of actually living at their expense. A green museum is a museum which incorporates the three columns of sustainability into its operations, in its programming and facility. I think that is an important point to make. And one thing which is a little bit more hopeful, I think, is that caring about the environment is kind of a natural extension of a museum's primary role of stewardship, right? It's not something else. Climate change doesn't happen on planet Mars. It happens right here. And museums are actually a good place, actually a very good place to discuss about what it means and actually what it means for us if we want to try to preserve sustainably our heritage and our collections. That's why we set up the Green Museum more than 10 years ago in Germany, which is a conference series every year, traveling around Austria, Switzerland, Germany, but also, exported to China, where we organized many, maybe 5 Green Museum workshops. You can see here also my colleagues from Poland, Łukasz Brataś and Paul Klenz Larsen from Denmark, who were speakers at one of our several Green Museum events in China. Well, the growing international debate about museums, climate change, illustrates, and about cultural heritage, illustrates that there's no single monolithic way of understanding heritage. And that means that also preservation and conservation must reflect the diversity of perspectives. Perspectives which are, and I think that's an important point, I think, in this course also, perspectives which are subject to a continuous change as a function of space and time. We are building museums at a very high pace. That's actually a picture of our Humboldt Forum, which is about to open in the coming days in the middle of Berlin, the reconstruction of the former royal castle. Another new museum, which, by the way, is as climate hostile as you can imagine. I get back to this later. But I would like to make a little journey back in time. This is the Beinecke Library at Yale University by Gordon Banshaft, a wonderful museum building. And when it opened in 1963, the Yale Daily News wrote, there's a design of the building, which means HVAC systems, right, climatization to provide the necessary protection and environment. So these documents would endure another 2,000 years. Or, it's refrigerated at a level below human comfort. The atmosphere is kept at temperature and humidity that's considered the best for the preservation of non-living things. I think it's a very funny definition, the preservation of non-living things. But look at the number of 2,000 years. That is the spirit of the 1960s, maybe the 1970s. I don't think you will find a lot of conservation scientists who would nowadays speak about preservation horizons of 2,000 years. Don't have to be as pessimistic as the Menominee Indians in Wisconsin, but 2,000 years is, I think, quite a long period of time. Well, the issue behind that HVAC systems, green museums, mostly is running and maintaining a museum climatized, where you have to deal with the environmental stability criteria. And that's what the Americans, I think it was 12 years ago, called the plus-minus dilemma. The plus-minus dilemma, which is hitting us, especially in times where we have to look at our carbon footprint, because climatization makes museums very, very expensive with a very high carbon footprint. Get back to this a little bit later. Well, you shouldn't have too low humidities, right? Because if you have too low humidities, you're risking mechanical damage. You also shouldn't have too high humidities because, at humidities above 75%, you risk biodegradation or also chemical, actually, corrosion. You have a chemical decay accelerated when temperatures get too hot. And unfortunately, not so much the objects, but for workers' protection and for staff, human comfort, actually, you have also minimum temperatures, which means that, you have to look for the sweet spot, right? Where is your plus-minus dilemma? There is your plus-minus dilemma, that you have to find climatization or not climatization. You can do this by constructing the building in the proper way. But it's very clear that, there are boundaries, right? We don't really want heritage in our museums to be exposed to totally fluctuating, free of any bounds, relative humidity and temperature. Why? Well, because there is a mechanical response to humidity cycling, first and foremost, right? You can measure this. You can put it and translate it into numbers. Like here, dilatation stands in our lab. Whenever you increase humidity, you also see materials expanding. Whenever you dry, you see materials are shrinking. And if you repeat the process a long time, very often this is a reversible process, right? It's shrinking, it's expanding, it's shrinking, it's expanding. Not always, actually. It is reversible. Sometimes once this picture gets out of control, it's getting more and more expansion, more and more shrinkage, and then what happens? You have cracks. You have, paint flakes which are falling off. You have cracks in your furniture, and well, damage appears, right? The same or similar applies to temperature. We are a spoiled, generation on this planet. We now want to have high temperatures. I show you two thermometers of the German thermometers, one from the 1915 and one from 1930. In 1915, you can see on the left, the room temperature, Zimmerwärme, was indicated to be like 16 degrees Celsius. In 1930, people got a little bit more spoiled. The room temperature was put to 17.5 degrees Celsius. And I can tell you that you will not find many people in the end of the 20th century and the 21st century who like to be at 16 degrees Celsius. We have much higher comfort levels. As I showed you before, 19 degrees is the minimum in our workers' condition here in Germany in our museums. For artifacts, that's not necessarily important, right? I mean, Garry Thomson, who wrote the Museum Environment, the famous book, said, the 19 to 24 degrees winter-summer kind of range was dictated by staff comfort and visitors. And you can find it in many, many guidelines. It is not really related to what the museums want to have, right? The objects want to have, because for many objects would be better if temperatures would be lower. Actually, in fact, not higher. And also, take into account that a lot of our heritage is not in museums, it's actually in churches, like in Italy, the Santa Mariosa, what is it called? Santa Maria Gloriosa de Fiari in Venice. An environment which has been fluctuating all over the centuries, right? It's not climatized. So that's the climate in this church. You see the temperature, the humidity fluctuating between 32 and almost 80% of relative humidity, and of course correspondingly with the temperatures. And nevertheless, many of these objects survived until today. Traditionally, in climatization, we have natural air exchange through leakages, joints, windows, doors, and we have to always keep in mind that the first HVAC system, the first climatization systems date back for the 1950s, 1960s in Germany, end of the 60s. The new Neue Nationalgalerie, New National Gallery in 1968 was one of the first buildings in Germany which was fully climatized. By the way, it just was renovated and is also now one of our most climate hostile museums, which we have in Berlin. Why is that the case? This, I show you some diagrams of relative humidity. Is a famous building, of course. It's iconic, built by Mies van der Rohe, but you have huge fluctuations, right? Also in this building, although it is climatized. Well, why is this the case? Because you have steel, you have glass, you have no material which can buffer, no mortars, no wood, no earthen renderings. And on that night in 2012, it was outside maybe minus 15 degrees, minus 20, really cold night. You see what happens if you want to climatize a museum to 50% RH. You create first what you can call an indoor fountain, condensation of water on the glass windows, and then of course freezing into ice. And that's all too normal observation in this kind of building. So I would say Mies van der Rohe built this building in 1968. And it's of course iconic, and I'm not I don't want to be too much judging his plans, because it's really a famous architectural icon. It was 5 years before the first oil crisis, which came in 1973. And it was actually 46 years before the Paris Climate Accord was signed. What I think is revolting is that we're still building museums, like the Humboldt Forum, which I showed you, or the Museum of the 20th Century in Berlin, which are definitely climate hostile, which use more energy than all our old museums. And I think this new museum, for example, is going to open in 2026, supposedly. using so much energy and having such an immense carbon footprint that I think it's a difference if you build a building 46 years before the Paris Accord or 10 years after. Well, the big issue, of course, for the climate debate are the people, right? The visitors. If we would be able to close our museums and not open doors and windows and nothing, we had much less of a problem with stabilizing relative humidity. But unfortunately, or fortunately, right, because it's our mission, dissemination, one of the core missions of museums, we have to open the door. And sometimes if we have exhibitions like here on Museum Island or the new National Gallery, well, people are lining up in long, long queues and causing actually a problem. The Garry Thomson's, class 1 specification, 50% plus minus 5, has seen a relaxation over the years in the standards. The Smithsonian, actually, people like Marion Mecklenburg were, at the forefront of this debate, advocated for a relaxation to 8% relative humidity. The Bizot group in 29, but also 2012, the temporary guidelines say that for most objects, 50 to 60% are probably okay. And you can see this new approach reflected in the temporary guidelines also from ICOM ISC 2014. And if you are lucky and can afford the ASHRAE standard 2019, you will see that there's a lot of development in this field, and a lot goes into the relaxation of this very tight and narrow climatization bands. Because imagine if you have a very narrow band, your costs are exponentially high, and you also have to have respectively a very high carbon footprint. So yeah, I mean, museums are somehow in a permanent conflict with sustainability principles, because they have one of the core missions is actually to collect, right, to expand their collections. Many thousands of tons of CO2 are emitted by museums which run climatized storage and climatized exposition halls. So how much energy actually do we use in museums is a very important question, and I get to this in a moment. And actually, how does the energy consumption by museums actually fit to the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations? Well, we have by law, and not because the Radkin Research Laboratory is advocating for less energy consumption. We have by law, we are asked in Germany, but also in the European Union, to reduce our carbon emissions. And you can see that as for Germany, well, we're not really very successful. We met our 2020 goal in Germany, but I'm now joking, right? Thanks to Corona crisis, we were lucky, but we are far from meeting the further reduction as we want to have it, and as we have to have it, because as I showed you in my very first slide, climate change is as not only human made, but it's also affecting everybody on this planet directly or indirectly. So what are museums doing? For example, the Tate in 2019, in the summer, they declared climate emergency and wanted to save at least 10% of their carbon emission until 2023, which is actually tomorrow, right? It doesn't sound very ambitious, but in fact, I think it is ambitious, and we'll see whether they manage. Our museums here in Berlin, well, we use energy for electricity, for cooling, and for heating mostly. We are in total about 70 million kilowatt hours in the year, and we see that this over the years is kind of constant. And in some areas, actually in some museums, it's actually slowly increasing. And also, please keep in mind that I only talk here about the maintaining and the maintenance and the running of the museums. I do not speak about what we call gray energy which is actually in every building, in every new construction building. And I already showed you the Humboldt Forum. I told you about the new National Gallery renovated, the Museum of the 20th Century, new storage areas. So we're building and renovating also the Pergamon Museum. And this gray energy is due to the fact that for every building you need to, heat up for burning your cement. You need to heat it up for 1500 degrees. You need to melt glass. You need to melt actually steel as well. And to really document this gray energy is not so easy. It's more easy to document, of course, the running costs because, you get an invoice, right, once a month. So, 70 million of kilowatt hours just for Berlin museums. You can calculate your energy consumption, of course, if you want to benchmark it, right, you have to divide it by the square area or the volume of your museum. And, we collected for many museums together with my friend and colleague Łukasz Bratasz from Krakow. We collected many data of museums, and you see they're ranking kind of, from 800, 900. You can, in the United States, you can also find museums which have 1500 kilowatt hours per square meter. But I kept them out of this picture so that you can see it more, accurately. That there are also the passive storage building of the National Museum in Denmark in Vejle is just on the left. You can hardly see it, right? It's like 8 kilowatt hours per square meter in a year. So if you are ranking your energy consumption between, let's say, 8 and 800, in red, by the way, are the museums which we have here in Berlin for comparison. So we have also museums which do not really use a lot of energy, but on the right, for example, you see that the Museum of the 20th Century, which is, as I said before, to be opened in 26. Is the highest of our Berlin museum. So the sad part of the story, people think, the younger the museum is, the less energy it uses. No, the opposite is the case. And that's due to the fact that, they are usually fully climatized. The worst thing is, when we made this compilation of data, museums are not very open and transparent about their energy consumption. They sometimes seem to hide this data more diligently than the provenance of the objects on display. It's a contested issue, right? But I would say if we want to build a green museum, we should take the median or the average value, let's say 300. Should say, well, if you really want to do something with carbon reduction, you have to go down by 50%, 55, as we sometimes say, which means you should not build a museum using more than 100, 120 kilowatt hours per square meter a year. And then I encourage you, go to your museums in your country and see what they use, and you will not find very encouraging answers, I guess. Sometimes, transparency is quite open, like here with the Yale University, where every child can go to the internet and see what is the energy consumption of the art gallery, for example. Does it go up? Does it go down? And of course, when we talked, about this orgy of museums buildings in worldwide, actually, right? We should not forget that it takes many decades, many years, maybe 60, 70, 80 years, until a new museum, even if it's built according to the Platinum LEED standard, right, or BREEAM or the BNB, as we have in Germany, even it's built very sustainably, it will take decades until it comes clear with the emission balance with an old existing building. That's due to what I was mentioning before with the gray energy. One thing which I think we should keep in mind is that, this book by Michael Mann, former Yale colleague, that, who is actually responsible, right, for this big footprints? It's not the museums. I mean, only 100 companies are responsible for over 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Concrete, by the way, would be, if it would be a country, it would rank third behind United States and China in terms of CO2 emissions. And one interesting fact on the side is that China has processed as much cement in 3 years, from 2011 to 2013, as the United States did in the entire 20th century. A lot of carbon footprint comes from our data servers. There's an estimate of 2%. Just by the of data servers, and every Google search, right, is like 0.2 gram. You can read this up. Now a video conference like ours, where people have turned on their screens, their videos using more energy, then videos turned off, or laptops worse than desktops, cell phones even worse. So there's also a carbon footprint of our digital transformation, especially now after the COVID period. I would like to make a short reference to an ad, commercial from 1970s in the United States. Older people, every American knows Iron Eye Cody, which the famous sentence was, people start pollution, people can stop it. It was about bottles and garbage on the side of the streets. It was very efficient, people understood, okay, it's me, I can do something to stop it. Like now, I can try to stop the climate change if I eat less meat and if I drive less cars and use more public transport. Definitely it's true. But at the end of the day, this ad showed us, the Indian was actually not an Indian, it was an Italian living in Santa Monica, California, but it was sponsored by the soft drink industry. And what it actually managed was to delay recycling efforts for another 10, 20, 30 years. So let's not get trapped in the picture that we are the responsible ones, or the museum climatization is the responsible one. It's not. It's just a small piece in the puzzle. But they are public buildings in many countries, right? They have to serve as a role function. They have to, they have to be more climate friendly than they actually are, or at least our new museums shouldn't be like worse than what Klenze built in the first half of the 19th century in Munich with the Alte Pinakothek, or our ancestors who built more energy efficient museums. Museums, shouldn't be contested spaces, but safe spaces for these discussions, right? They have to change, they have to transform. Otherwise, they're gonna lose their significance, I'm afraid. They should become an agora of knowledge. And they still have way to go, of course, when we talk about colonial, illicit traffic, colonial objects in our collections, we know that. But museums are also, especially in our countries, high trust institutions. People believe what is created, the knowledge which is created in museums. And they're well situated to engage the public to actually discuss about these challenges. We have to think out of the box. And that means that, we have to discuss, right? Who is owning our cultural heritage? What are we letting go? What are we losing? What are we accepting that we lose it? Which climatic corridors we really want to run, whether we need at all HVAC systems and climatization. And this debate, I think, cannot be only about the objects or the museums alone. It has to be also about the people who have a link to the cultural heritage, who use it, who want to learn from it, want to enjoy it, and who at the end maybe want to preserve it as well. One of my most projects which I took most impressions from was a conservation project, training project in Syria in the middle of the war, 2016. People who were actually interested in documenting the heritage, right, and translating conditions into numbers. We have to think about the people whose life is inscribed on these objects as an important factor. Well, the most apocalyptic masterpiece in the Louvre actually is Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa. They're clinging to this raft, left like with nothing. Civilization has died. I like this painting because it reminds me that, if the scientists are right and we're not getting to the 1.5 temperature degrees increase, without keeping the increase in these boundaries of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're not talking about the civilization as we know it today. And then, of course, I'm asking, if we are far from civilization, like these guys here on the raft, well, probably we also won't need museums anymore. That's why I think museums and memory institutions, also heritage scientists, you're in a doctoral school, right? You're learning a lot about measurements, documentation, climatic systems, like room climatic systems in museums. But museums and museum workers, conservation scientists, heritage scientists have to take a stand and have to engage in this current debate, where public institutions are under threat all over the world. I mean, that's not only in Europe, it's not only in the US, it's everywhere. And I think this is my final slide. Yes, a banner which we put up last year in the middle of the pandemic crisis, and it said, you know, we are for being open to the world, and we are standing in for democratic values against racism, anti-Semitism, nationalism, and hate. That would be my message. You know, look at the results you obtain in your preservation work. Look at your research, of course. Ask the questions whether that's really the right way to go. Look at the priorities, what is important, what is less important, and don't just hide behind the idea that your museum or your university is just you know, not playing a big role in the society. It actually is, and it's worth that. I think we think not only about the objects but also about the people, as I said before. And I thank you very much for your presentation. I don't know how to for your attention. I don't know how to stop my presentation now. Thank you.
You have just to go again on the upper row and click on the share, the third button on the right.
Yes, like here maybe.
Okay, great.
Right?
Great. Thank you, Stefan. I liked it a lot. I mean, it looks like you are becoming a philosopher more than an heritage scientist, which is something that makes me really very, very happy. I don't know whether it is a result of the age, of a result